Crime data analyst Jeff Asher on what's happening with the murder rate. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week's episode is brought to you by the Dispatch. We'll hear a little bit more about them at the end of the show, but we are going to be focusing on crime and crime data and what the numbers are telling us. So that is why we have brought back Jeff Asher, who is a crime data analyst, to talk about all those things with us. Welcome back to the show, Jeff. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. And I know my Nationals didn't make the playoffs, so I guess we have to talk about crime data.
Yes. Well, I went to the two games at the for whatever reason, they had like bookended series with the Nats in DC, and I live in Virginia now. So I went to both those series, and the last two of three, the Phillies lost the two that I went to and won the third one.
Hey, we might be good next year. So
maybe if you can keep that one guy from gambling until 8 a.m, I guess, on your road trips. It's very insider baseball stuff going on here. Yes. We're playing the Mets for the first time in the playoffs, which sounds like a made up stat, but is not somehow. The Phillies and Mets have never played in the playoffs before. And so I guess we'll see how it goes. Hopefully the Phillies dominate, but we'll see. Speaking of made up stats or things that sound made up or controversy over stats, well, first off, tell people a little bit about your background, who you are, and what you do.
I do crime data analysis, so both analyzing what the data says and analyzing the quality of the data. I have a company that we work mainly in criminal justice, but we work in education and nonprofit world as well, and just providing consulting on data quality, data trends, data anything.
Mm-hmm. It's AH Datalytics, right?
Yep, that's us.
Nice. And you also run a sort of live crime stat reporting operation as well, right?
Yeah. So we have a grant from Arnold Ventures to launch, and we launched about a month ago, the Realtime Crime Index, realtimecrimeindex.com, all one word. And it is a database of monthly crime data with about a month and a half lag we have around 300 agencies reporting data that we're able to grab each month. So we've got a sizable sample, and it allows us to hopefully see national trends as they develop. And the goal is to have 500 to 1,000 agencies. And part of that is we'll probably expand from 50,000 or more as our cutoff to 40,000 or more as our cutoff, and we want to basically get as many crimes as possible so that you can be predictive of the national trend through as few agencies as possible so that you can do something that is doable from month to month. Right.
And so you actually go to the police departments themselves. I mean, obviously, a lot of this is publicly available data that the police departments publish each month, although everybody has a little bit of a different method, it sounds like. But you're going straight to the original source for this information. And then so you have experience doing that. And you also write stories around that data that you collect, this raw data, which will often lead news coverage, because basically, if it's not FBI reporting something and it makes news about crime, it's usually something that you guys have put out, right? But so you have experience with the raw data, and then also you have a lot of experience looking at FBI data as well, right?
Yeah, and noticing where the issues are, because there's always issues with crime data, and
sure.
And I think that there's a tendency in this country to point out what have been imperfections in the data for the last 100 years of this program as some sort of proof that you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And so kind of hopefully identifying, okay, yes, this is a problem. This does not change, what 400 places are saying just because one place has a clear data reporting issue.
Right. And that's kind of what we want to cut through, because a lot of that's politically motivated, right? Crime data is very political because what the crime is doing, which direction it's headed, up or down, has political impacts on people running for office or people in office. So that's why I wanted to bring you on and try to cut through some of the noise that's out there and try to get a real good understanding of what's actually happening. It seems, my impression is that crime has been dropping. We've talked about this, for a while now. You've been on the show before, I think several times. And one of the big trends in recent years is that crime is receding, but it's receding from this huge spike we saw during around 2020, the pandemic, the rioting that we had, and all the associated bad stuff that came along with that seemed to have led to a huge increase in murder and other forms of crime. But since then, that's begun to go down, and it's gone down at a pretty quick pace. Let's just start with murder. What have we seen happen to the murder rate this year and for the last couple of years?
Yeah, so murder in 2020 rose 30%, largest by far increase ever recorded. And I think the previous large was like 12%. So, number one, both in terms of the percentage, and then number one, over 5,000 more murder victims in 2020 compared to 2019. So massive increase in murder from 2019 to 2020. 2021, it was about the same, maybe up, down a little bit, not a ton of change. 2022, it fell likely a little bit. Last year, 2023, murder fell at what was until then the largest, the fastest rate ever recorded, almost a 12% decline in murder, according to the FBI's data, which we can back up with CDC data, we can back up with gun violence archive data, and see that, these things fell at a very fast rate. And then looking to 2024, right now in the Real-Time Crime Index, we have murder down about 17% in 300 cities with available data through July. We're looking at, so if 12% was the largest, now we're looking at 17, maybe even more percentage points drop in 2024, which we're still about 9 or 10% above 2020 or 2019's rate in 2023. So with this year added on, we should be at or below 2019's rate. So we basically, that 2020 huge surge in the span of 2 years, essentially have completely erased that, which is a really incredible trend, I think. And it's unfortunate that we've had this disagreement, or whatever you want to call it, about whether or not it's real, because the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that this is happening just as it happened in 2020. We can argue about who was to blame or what was to blame for 2020. We can argue about who's to credit, what's to credit for what we're seeing now. And we should be having those discussions, and we should be doing that research. But what I guess disagree with is the idea that we can't measure this accurately, because we 100% can.
Okay. So, and I want to start with murder, because I feel like murder, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, but I feel like murder is probably where we're going to have the best data, because it's where we're going to miss the least amount of crimes. Murder, I'm not saying every murder is attributed to being a murder. Like, I'm sure some things that were murders don't actually get reported as murders, but it's much, I would imagine, much easier to track murders than a lot of other kinds of crimes, because a lot of other crimes can go on unreported, or what have you. So murder, though, it seems very, very clear in the data that it had this huge increase and has now had a very sharp decline. And where are we at right now, by the way? Are we back below the pre-pandemic numbers, the pre-2019 numbers? Or are we back in line with where things were before this spike? What are you seeing right now?
It's hard to say exactly. I think if you kind of do the math looking forward, we're probably in this year, we're probably going to match 2019's or be slightly below 2019's rate. It's kind of complicated because big cities, murder rose everywhere in 2020, but it rose a little bit more in big cities than in smaller places. And we tend to overstate the measurements that we're able to take come from big cities. So if smaller places are seeing a similarly sized decline as big cities, then you'd basically see big cities might be at or slightly above 2019 and the rest of the country below it. So all of the evidence, though, suggests that essentially we're at or below where we were 2019-ish. We're not quite to those sort of historic lows that we reached in 2014. But if you were to see another similarly sized drop in 2025, you'd be at that level. And I don't know that, I would, my instinct is that we're probably going to see things kind of level off, but my instinct was not that we would inherently see incredibly fast declines in 2023 and 2024. So who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. And just to talk about real quick, why you're so confident in these numbers, like you think that this trend that we've seen and the data that we're getting now is accurate, and that we can measure this stuff reliably. Because we've had you on the show before. We did talk about, for instance, the FBI in the way that it tracks crime, had a switchover in the procedures it was using and the technology it was using to get reports from local police departments. That's how they track crime, right? They have local police departments voluntarily submit reports to them about their crime data, and they did it on one system, and then was it 2021 during this spike period, they switched from the old system to the new system, and they didn't, during that period, they had issues with data collection, right?
Yeah. So they switched to NIBRs from what's known as SRS. Your average person doesn't need to know what those stand for or anything, but sure. Basically they switched to a new system that is more encompassing more crimes. Mm-hmm. And so they went from, on average, about 95% of the nation's population is covered by an agency that reports data each year. And so that was the case pre-NIBRs. NIBRs has been around since the 80s. So it's been around, and they just said they mandated that agencies were going to report. So it's not anything that's new. I saw somebody refer to it as woke, which is like, if you can imagine some contractor in the FBI in 1986 coming up with a crime data collection system and then 40 years later being called woke for it. It's not new. The mandate came under the Obama administration. It was carried out under the Trump administration, and it was first reported under the Biden administration. So right. We've got lots of hands in the fire here.
And government moves very slowly on these things.
Yes, especially the FBI and data collection.
But it just so happened that the deadline for switching over was in this chaotic period of 2021. And,
yes.
And it did result in problems at the time, right?
Major problems. And I wrote about it and nobody cared. They went from basically 95% reporting to about 60% reporting, which means if you're making up 5% of the gap, you're estimating, but you don't really need a margin of error. You understand what's happening. And especially if you're consistent about it, if you're estimating what 40% of the gap is, you need really large margin of error there. And so that's what the FBI did. The 2021 numbers are crap, to be honest. And they
put disclaimers on all that at the time too, right?
Yeah. And they acknowledged it. And it was a thing that was known. 2022, the FBI backtracked and said, okay, agencies that have not made the switch to the new system can still report under the old system, and we'll just translate it and give you the crime numbers. So that
was the problem, right? That was the sort of classic government issue of like, this is a voluntary program. These police agencies don't have to switch to the new system if they don't want to. Right. They don't have to report anything at all to the FBI if they don't want to. And a bureaucratic changeover like that, even with decades of forewarning, tends to go poorly in a lot of government situations. And that seems like that was the issue, right?
Entirely. And you have to have motivation, and the Uniform Crime Report has always been voluntary. The FBI has never been able to compel agencies to report data. Right. So they went from about 60 to 65% coverage in 2021 to 94%, 93.5% in 2022. It ticked up to 94.3% in 2023. So very normal level of coverage. Historically, 94% has been the average if you go back to 1960. So
Okay.
Yeah, it was what we would expect for coverage.
So there was a problem, but it was literally just that 1 year, 2021. And then the FBI said, never mind, you can keep, I mean, obviously I'm sure they want people to transition to the new system, but they will still accept the old procedures.
Yeah. And they've gone in 2023, only 12% of agencies reported data under the old system. So you're up to 83% of the population is reporting under the new system. They're very much getting there, and it's not a big deal. But it became a big deal because a bunch of people misread a old Marshall Project article that basically miscited or misstated what was happening in 2022. And regardless, and it then became an issue. And once it's an issue, people, dig in and aren't willing to learn new information.
But so for the 2024 numbers, they do encompass 94.3, I think you said, % of the population.
That's the 2023 numbers. Yeah.
Because the FBI is a bit delayed on this stuff. We don't get the full year numbers until well into the next year, right?
Yeah. We just got the 2023 numbers 2 weeks ago.
Right. So, but for those numbers, they do cover 94+% of all of the police department or the population of the United States, the police departments that represent that population, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And so let's talk a little bit now about some of the other broader crime trends. Like murder is one thing to track. Then you have all kinds of other crimes, violent crimes, property crimes. What are we seeing in the numbers for those?
So the FBI had a 3% decline in violent crime. Reported violent crime, we have to separate. We know that not every crime gets reported. Mm-hmm. The FBI showed a slight, like a 6% increase in violent crime in 2020. So the real story was not that violent crime surged or that crime surged. It was that murder and gun violence surged, that we had a huge increase in shootings, a huge increase in murder. And that has come down. Violent crime has also come down it basically has erased the gains of 2020. In 2023, it was slightly below 2019's rate, and it was slightly above 2014's rate. And 2014 was the lowest violent crime rate since 1970. So it didn't really have a lot to fall in order to reach that, but violent crime has fallen. Property crime fell in 2023, like 2.4%. But you saw large decreases in burglary and theft and a 12% increase in motor vehicle theft. So motor vehicle theft, because of that trick to steal Kias and Hyundais, big increase. If you looked at 2024, the Real-Time Crime Index, we're showing about a 4 or 5% decline in violent crime. So still seeing a sizable decline in violent crime and a 9% decrease in property crime, because that huge increase in motor vehicle thefts has sort of hit its peak and is starting to come down. And so, you had 4 straight years of increasing motor vehicle thefts. So a 20% decline on top of that of 40, 50% increase is not that much. But you're starting to see large declines in property crime. So that would be my guess, is that we'll see historic decline in murder this year. Okay, decline in violent crime, probably to the lowest level reported since 1970, and then a very large decline in property crime. And property crime last year, I think the property crime rate was the lowest since like 1965 or something like that. So
that's interesting.
And again, only a third of property crimes get reported to the police.
Right.
Only half of violent crimes get reported to the police, other than murder.
Yeah, but just to set the story there, violent crime and property crime did not see the same sort of massive increase that murder did. And so maybe they're back down a bit, but there wasn't that as much fluctuation in those things, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. And the long-term trend of property crime has been declining every year. 2022, I think, was the first time in like 30 years that you saw an increase in property crimes, only because you saw probably an artificially low rate in 2020 and 2021 due to the pandemic.
Yeah, so very different impacts and effects on those areas of crime. And yeah, getting into this, the idea, I mentioned before, murder seems a little bit easier to track than some of these other things because it's less likely to go unreported. Not that it can't, but it's less likely to happen. And so what are some of the issues? How do we know that like violent crime and property crime are going unreported? You know, obviously we have the numbers that the FBI gets, but we have research and we have data that suggests that there's a lot of violent crime and property crime doesn't, as you mentioned there, doesn't actually get reported. How do we know that?
So the Bureau of Justice Statistics runs something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which every year they publish a table showing the share of crimes. Obviously, you can't survey murder victims. So they survey every other crime type. And people say whether or not they reported it to the police. I think NCVS is great. It's a wonderful tool. I think that it's a survey. They're surveying 220,000 people. So it's a large survey, but unless you're going to say that what the New York Times presidential poll says is 100% the truth, there's a margin of error there. And there's a margin of error in any survey.
As other surveys, yeah.
And so I think people have a tendency to ignore the margin of error, which at times can be sizable, especially if you're diving in and, you know, they're extrapolating national trends from 0.7% of the country's population. You gotta, you know, if you had 50 people out of 220,000 said that they were the victim of an aggravated assault, there's a large margin of error in there as to exactly what that means for our national rate. And so there has been a recent tendency, I think, to use, it shows X% change or whatever. But for the most part, NCVS shows a similar picture compared to what the FBI data is showing. NCVS and UCR don't agree on what happened in 2020 and 2021. And I'd point out that it was hard to do in-person surveys in 2020 and 2021. So like something weird makes sense in a survey those years. The 2023 NCVS that just came out showed a slight decline in violent crime from 2022, although within the margin of error. And that violent crime in 2023 was not statistically different from 2019. And if you look at so that's all the crime, the reported and unreported. And if you look at the reported crime, it shows a slight decline in violent crime from 2022 to 2023 and largely the same rate of violent crime in 2023 compared to 2019. So we're speaking the same language. The disagreements there, I think, are largely around the periphery and largely due to people kind of overusing what NCVS does and doesn't do well.
So following up on that a little bit, have we seen in these surveys any increase in the number of people who aren't reporting crimes? Like, are there more crimes going unreported according to these than before, or is it pretty much the same rate?
No, it's pretty much the same. Again, there's a margin of error there, but in 2023, the share went up from like 41% of violent crimes to 46% or 45%. So the numbers over the last decade or so have not changed at all. If you go back 30 years or 20 years, you see a higher share saying that they reported violent crimes. But it doesn't explain anything having to do with our current crime trends.
Interesting. Okay. And so the FBI has also started to do, I guess they're kind of competing with you a little bit, I guess, because now they're releasing quarterly reports, right, for the first time. Yeah.
So they've been releasing quarterly reports. I think people need to take them, especially early in the year, with a very large grain of salt. Mm-hmm. The first quarter. So basically, let's say you run a department. Your department reports data to their state UCR program. The state UCR program reports it to the FBI. You have underreported your March data. You have until April of 2025 to report your March 2024 data. The FBI takes it and they publish it. And you had only half of March included in there. So your number shows, and they're comparing 2.5 months of your first quarter data to 3 months of first quarter data last year. And so they're showing across the board really large declines. As time goes on, you're going to fix that problem. And 11.5 months of complete data means that the missing half month is much less of a big deal than 2.5 months, or 2.5 out of 3. So the problem becomes less and less as the year goes on, But the FBI is showing implausibly high declines across the board compared to what we see in other data sources. So I think it validates that what we're seeing in other data sources is probably accurate. But I think that when you deal with the quarterly data, you have to know what's being reported, and that maybe the first and the second quarter, you kind of take with a really big grain of salt.
Okay, interesting. So, the FBI's data reporting for the year is pretty reliable outside of the 2021, and but perhaps the quarterly reports are going to introduce a lot more noise because of this issue you just described about.
The fourth quarter report that the FBI reported in March of this year for 2023 was really good. On average, it was off by 2%. It overstated declines, but it said it was a 13.2% decline in murder, and there was a 11.6% decline or 11.7% decline. They showed was it a 5% decline in violent crime, and there was a 3% decline in violent crime. So yeah, those aren't perfect, but if it's wrong and it's wrong in a way that's knowable, that's a really valuable tool. And if you can think, okay, maybe the third quarter reports when they're released, let's add 4%, and the fourth quarter reports, let's add 2%. That tells us what the numbers are, even if we're kind of doing some back of the napkin math on those.
Okay. And so where are the trends headed as of today? I mean, we're still expecting to see another significant decline in the murder rate by the end of this year. Is there anything that you see that concerns you? Maybe that'll reverse or slow down the pace?
Not yet. I mean, the pace has stayed the same pretty much. So I think what we'll see is the largest decline in murder ever recorded. You can have me back next September, October, and we can revisit these predictions. But I think largest decline in murder, sizable decline in violent crime, probably to the lowest rate recorded in 50 plus years. And then a very large decline in property crime, which is, again, last year's decline in property crime was mostly just due to being muted, was due to motor vehicle theft rising a lot. If you reverse motor vehicle theft, then you should see a much larger decline in property crime. So all of those trends add up, and that's what the numbers that we're seeing. It's what, even taking it with a grain of salt, that's what the quarterly FBI data is showing. It's what the Gun Violence Archive data is showing. It's what the city data is showing. So I'm not going out on a limb on all of this. We have lots of different data sources telling us the same story.
Okay. And so let's get into a little bit more speculative space here. And it's perfectly all right if you don't have competent answers to these things. But one, you mentioned this earlier, but so the data is fairly clear on what has happened, right? But we don't know. I guess it's more of an open question as to why. Is there anything we can find in the data that will tell us why we saw this massive increase followed by
I'll leave that to researchers. And I mean, criminologists aren't sure why murder and violent crime fell in the 90s. So I think it's very early to be making sort of declarative statements about why it's doing these things now.
Yeah. Because obviously there's lots of theories out there. Police pullback, there's all sorts of stuff that people will bring up, but I guess there's no consistent consensus among researchers at this point on any of this stuff. Even going, like you mentioned, even back to the drop off in the 90s. Yeah.
I think it's something that takes a long time to figure out, and we can just barely tell the trends. So, so that I think is it's
an open question.
It's a very much open question that I think will be an open question for quite a while.
Well, that's unsatisfying, but truthful.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. I'd rather hear that than try to, you trying to make up a perfect solution for why this has happened. But, and then I guess the other one is forward looking. After the 90s decline, we had this extremely long period of relatively low murder rate in the United States, and I guess property crime decline and so forth. But is there anything that could tell you what direction things are going to head? I mean, you mentioned earlier that you thought maybe it's going to smooth out. We're not going to keep seeing these record declines in the murder rate year over year. Why is that?
I mean, regression of the mean usually happens. But I don't know. And because it's so complicated and we can't really explain it 100%, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. And I think anybody that's saying exactly what's going to happen is probably making things up.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm with you as far as like, I feel like this was a wild spike and now we're regressing back to where things were. And maybe this was some, all of the chaos of 2020 took the country in a very bad direction, but for a pretty short period of time. And now maybe we're headed back to where we had been. But realistically, there's no way to know that, right?
Yeah. No, there's absolutely not.
Right. So I know that's probably not the most satisfying thing for people to hear, but it's true, right? You can't know what's going to happen just based off of what the trends have been. It's like trying to predict the stock market, right?
Yeah. And if you can't explain it, you can't describe it.
There may be macro trends that have been true for a while, or there's certainly wisdom and time in the market versus timing the market, that kind of stuff. And I think that's probably true with crime data too. You can't, you can look at how things have been and maybe make some guesses, some informed guesses off of that, but you can't guarantee that's how things will turn out, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, hey, if people want to follow your writing on this, where can they do that?
jasher.substack.com. And
great
try
resource.
to post weekly, sometimes more when crime data comes out. So
I read it all the time, and literally most of the media does. If you're reading a crime-based story that isn't sourced from the FBI directly, it's probably from Jeff Asher.
Yep.
So sign up for his newsletter and go straight to the source itself, and you'll be ahead of the trend in news reporting on these things. But yes, I appreciate you coming on the show and giving us your time and walking us through this so we can understand what the data says, what the real issues with it are, and what they aren't. Right. So I think that gives people a good insight, cuts through some of the political BS around all of this, and is very helpful. So I appreciate you.
Thank you
coming on the show.
We'll be on next year and we'll talk about this again.
Yes. We'll have you back on. We'll keep on top of these things for sure. But for now, I'm going to head it over to myself to talk a little bit more about the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Olive Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news in the same way that we do here at the Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.